The morning-room clock had not struck the hour since the old Earl's funeral, and no one in Ashfield Park had thought to wind it until Nora came. She stood on the low footstool she had carried from the corridor, her hands already inside the case, her fingers finding the familiar geometry of weight and wheel. She had learned clocks from her father, who had learned them from his, and she understood that a timepiece stopped at grief did not need coaxing so much as patience. The brass smelled of old oil and the faint mineral coolness of English autumn, and the morning room itself was dim at this early hour, the holland covers not yet drawn back from the furniture, the fire newly lit and not yet generous. Through the tall window she could see the park's elms in their October dressing, thinned yellow and stubborn, still holding what they had left. She had been at Ashfield Park for 11 days. 11 days as the lowest-ranking housemaid, assigned the rooms that the senior staff preferred to leave to cold mornings and their own inattention. She had not expected to be sent to the morning room at all. Mrs. Hollis, the housekeeper, had given her the assignment with the particular flatness that communicated neither warmth nor malice, only category. The morning room and the old library on the east wing were Nora's province, because they were inconvenient, and because no one else wished to rise before the kitchen fire was fully stoked. She did not mind. She had never minded. The movement inside the clock was furred with neglect, but intact. She turned the key with care, felt the mainspring accept it, listened as the wheel train began to breathe again. The pendulum, when she set it, swung with a steadiness that was almost courtly, and the first measured tick struck the silent room like the resumption of a conversation long interrupted. What she had not expected was the sound beneath the tick. Not mechanical. A rustle, soft and dry. She tilted the lantern she had brought, peered into the case's lower cavity, and saw the edge of folded paper wedged between the case's back panel and the pendulum housing. Old paper, the color of cream turned by time. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at anything unexpected inside a case, with care and without assumption. Because sometimes what appeared to be nothing was simply a packing shim, and sometimes it was something that had been placed there deliberately by a hand that had known exactly where it was putting it. She did not remove it. She set the clock running, stepped down from the footstool, and carried the lantern and the footstool back to the corridor. She had been taught that things in houses did not belong to her, and she had not forgotten. She pulled the morning room door closed behind her and went to find Mrs. Hollis. What happened in the 6 hours between that moment and the moment the Earl of Ashford walked into the morning room and found Nora standing at the clock again would reorder everything she had permitted herself to believe about the rest of her life. If you have ever watched a woman know something and hold it quietly while the world moves around her, stay with this story. Nora Fenn had come to Ashfield Park from the village of Horton Parva, 12 miles south, where her father had kept a small clock and watch repair shop on the high street for 31 years. He had died in February, at the end of a winter that had been harder than most, and the shop had reverted to the landlord 3 weeks after the funeral because there was no money to continue the lease and no son to inherit the trade. Nora was 23 years old, trained in the precise management of mechanical things, possessed of steady hands and an education that had ended at 14 when her mother died and left her the keeping of the household. She had no relatives of any standing. She had no prospects of the kind that required standing. She had applied to Ashfield Park because Mrs. Hollis had advertised in the Horton Parva notice sheet, and because domestic service at a great house was honest work, and because Nora had no tolerance for the kind of despair that expressed itself in the absence of occupation. The village of Horton Parva had concluded, without extensive deliberation, that Nora would likely not last the season in service. She was too quiet for easy management, they said, too particular, too accustomed to directing her own hours. Mrs. Tanner at the post office had told Mrs. Gilby at the draper's that it was a shame for a girl of that quality of mind to take housemaid's wages, and Mrs. Gilby had agreed in the way one agrees when one expects to be right. Neither of them had, in the course of offering their analysis, asked Nora what she herself thought of her circumstances. She had grown used to this. The dismissive label she had been assigned was a quiet one, as such things went in Horton Parva. She was, to anyone who wished to account for her in one phrase, merely the clockmaker's daughter, as though the clock shop had been her full horizon, and its closing had left her without one. Mrs. Hollis at Ashfield Park had her own version of the categorization. She expressed it on the third day, when Nora corrected the winding schedule of the bracket clock in the front hall, without having been asked. "You are here to dust and lay fires, Miss Fenn," she said, not unkindly, her voice carrying the particular patience one reserves for people who have not yet understood their situation. "You are not here to manage the clocks." "No, Mrs. Hollis," Nora said. She had understood the correction perfectly. She had also understood that the bracket clock in the front hall had been running 8 minutes fast for at least a fortnight, and that this would cause the household schedule to drift in small ways that accumulated, and that none of these things were her concern unless a housekeeper chose to make them so. She did not argue. She did not point this out. She wound what she was told to wind, and left what she was told to leave. She was, in the full accounting of Ashfield Park's staff hierarchy, a set of hands attached to a function. She was not Nora to anyone there. She was not even Fenn. She was simply the new girl, the clockmaker's daughter, the one who asked too few questions and minded too many things. It was in this capacity that she had found the paper in the clock. Mrs. Hollis listened to a report with the expression of someone who has heard such reports before, and found them, universally, to lead to complication. She set down her ring of keys. She said, in a tone that had sharpened by a degree, "You touched nothing. Nothing. I set the pendulum and wound the mainspring. And the paper is still inside. Yes." Mrs. Hollis looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite calculation and not quite assessment, and then she said, "I will inform his lordship. You will return to your other duties." "Of course," Nora said. She did not ask which his lordship, because there was only one since the old earl's death in March. She knew the basic facts that any new servant at a great house absorbs in the first week. Arthur Selby, the Earl of Ashford, had inherited the title from his father at the age of 34, and was at present in his first autumn of managing an estate he had not expected to inherit for another decade, because the old earl had declined far faster than anyone had predicted. He was not often spoken of by the staff except in terms of his requirements, which were few, and his manner, which was described by the upper housemaid, Jenny, as cold enough to frost the windows in July. The Dowager Countess, Arthur's mother, was still resident at the Dower House half a mile across the park, and she was spoken of considerably more, and in considerably lower voices. Nora returned to the East Library, where she was scheduled to turn the rugs and take stock of any books that required attention, and she thought about the paper inside the clock for the remainder of the morning. The East Library was a room that appeared to have been given up on some years before the old earl's decline. The rugs held the shape of furniture that was no longer there. The shelves along the north wall had been cleared of half their volumes, and those remaining stood in uneven rows, some tilting against neighbors who had migrated over the years, others still upright in the habitual posture of the long unread. There was a writing table under the east window that had ink stains from at least 3 decades, layered and distinct, and a wing chair near the fire whose upholstery had gone thin at the right arm in the way of a chair that had been used for reading every evening for a long time by a man with a particular way of settling his elbow. She thought, as she worked, that the clock case was a strange place for a document. The morning room clock was a long case piece, full height, with a deep lower cabinet for the pendulum and weights. It was precisely the kind of housing in which a paper could be secreted without risk of casual discovery. It would not be found by anyone who simply wound the clock, because the document was not in the movement housing above, but in the lower case below. It would only be found by someone who opened the lower door, which was only done for regulation of the pendulum or for cleaning, and only then by someone who tilted a light at a particular angle and noticed the edge of folded paper against the dark interior wood. She had been a clockmaker's daughter. She had tilted lights at particular angles inside dark cases her entire life. This was the only reason she had seen it. She was pulling the second rug back into position when she heard the door to the morning room open down the corridor. The voice she heard through the walls was not Mrs. Hollis's. It was a man's. Low, level. The particular register of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his volume. She could not make out words, only the cadence of authority and something beneath it that she could not immediately name. After a moment, she recognized it as the quality of careful attention, the tone of a man absorbing something unexpected with considerable control of his expression. She returned to the rug. She straightened the fringe along its border with her foot. She told herself that none of this was her concern. The morning room door opened again. Steps in the corridor. Then the East Library door opened, and the Earl of Ashford was standing in it. She had not seen him before at close distance. She had seen him crossing the great hall on her second morning, and once at the far end of the gallery where she had been dusting the mirror frames, and both times he had been in motion, purposeful, and without particular attention to his surroundings. He was a tall man, leaner than his height suggested, and the gray of his coat was a dark enough shade to read as black in poor light. His hair was dark and worn close, and his face in the East Library's autumn morning was not cold exactly, though she understood now why Jenny had reached for that word. It was controlled. The jaw held a quiet tension that might in another man have been called worry, and the eyes, which were a light, level gray, moved across the room and found her with a directness that was not the directness of a man noticing a servant. It was the directness of a man who wished to look at a thing as it actually was. He said, "You are the one who found it." She did not arrange her expression. She simply looked at him. "Yes, my lord." "Mrs. Hollis tells me you touched nothing beyond the movement." "That is correct." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her the way she had looked at the paper in the clock, with care and without assumption. Then he said, "I will need you to show me precisely where it was." She set down the rug brush and followed him to the morning room. The paper had not moved. She pointed to it through the open lower door without touching the case, and he reached in past her and drew it out with a steadiness of hand that she recognized as the discipline of someone accustomed to managing his own body's responses. He unfolded it carefully. She had already stepped back to give him the room and the privacy the moment required, and she was looking at the window and the October park beyond it, when he said, quite quietly, "How long have you been in service?" It was not precisely a question. The inflection was level. 11 days, my lord." She heard the paper settle in his hands. "My father's solicitor," he said, still at that controlled quietness, "has been unable to locate the deed of conveyance for the eastern parcel of this estate for the better part of 7 months. The search has been, at considerable cost, entirely fruitless." He paused. "Until this morning." She looked at him then. He was still holding the document, and his face had shifted by a very small degree, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something she could not quite categorize. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of something he had not anticipated. "My father," he said, was a man of particular methods. I had not thought to inquire about the clocks. The lower cases are often overlooked, Nora said. People attend to the movement. They do not always consider the cabinet. He looked at her. The morning room was entirely still, the clock ticking with its newly recovered steadiness, the fire small and yellow at the grate. You wound this clock yourself? Yes, my lord. You are assigned to this room. And the East Library. There was a pause of some length. Outside, in the park, a wood pigeon called once and was silent. The clock measured the distance between his looking at her and his looking away, and the distance was longer than it ought to have been. Do any of the other clocks in this house give you concern? He said. She ought to have said, I would not know, my lord. She ought to have deferred the question back to Mrs. Hollis and the upper staff and the ordinary machinery of household management. She said instead, The bracket clock in the blue drawing room has not been serviced in some time. The striking train is beginning to wear. He looked at her again. The acknowledgment in his face had deepened by another small, measurable degree. Come, he said. And he walked out of the morning room, and she followed him. And that was the beginning of the thing that could not be unmade. He took her through 3 rooms that morning, not in the manner of an employer conducting an inspection, and not in the manner of a man amusing himself with a novelty. He moved with the focused patience of someone who had decided to understand something properly, stopping at each clock, stepping back to let her open the cases, asking questions that were short and specific and listened to. She told him about the escapement in the library clock, which had a damaged pallet she could hear in the irregular tick. She told him that the gilt mantel clock in the upper drawing room had a suspension spring that was close to the end of its useful life. She told him that the long case clock in the great hall was in good working order, but had been incorrectly rated, gaining 3 minutes to the week, and that this could be corrected by lowering the rating nut on the pendulum rod by a single turn. He listened to all of it without interruption. He asked her once how she came to know these things, and she told him, briefly, about her father and the shop in Horton Parva, and she watched his face receive this information without visible judgment, and without the particular form of condescension that expressed itself as pity, and she was aware of something loosening in her chest that she had not known she was holding tight. She was aware of something else as well. She was aware of him in the way that was not about information. The warmth of him at the side of her arm when they stood before the hall clock together, and she pointed to the rating nut. The quality of his attention, which was given without reserve or performance. The way a man's attention was given when he had nothing to prove to the person receiving it. The slight shift of his posture when she said something he had not known. Not toward her exactly, but a fractional turn, a reorientation. As though she had altered slightly the direction of a thing he had thought was fixed. She told herself this was not her concern. She was the clockmaker's daughter. She was a housemaid, 11 days at a house she did not know, without position or standing or any claim on the consideration of an earl. She had been taught by 11 days of Mrs. Hollis, and by 23 years before that, what she was and what she was not. He thanked her when they returned to the morning room with a directness that was neither warmer nor colder than his manner throughout, and she understood that she had been dismissed. She gathered her things and went back to the East Library and thought, carefully, about nothing. That evening, in the servants' hall, Jenny told her that the Earl of Ashford had sent for Mr. Platt, the solicitor from Horton Parva, and that Mr. Platt was expected at 10 o'clock the following morning. The deed had apparently been located, Jenny said, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone who has discovered she is adjacent to an event of significance. Found in the morning room, of all places. In a clock. The senior footman, Thomas, said he was not surprised. The old earl had been peculiar about documents, said he did not trust the deed box, thought it was the first place anyone looked. "Who found it?" asked one of the kitchen girls, whose name was Polly. "The new girl," Jenny said. She looked across the table at Nora with something between amusement and assessment. "The clockmaker's daughter." Nora drank her tea. She did not explain, and no one asked her to. The solicitor arrived the following morning as expected, and the morning room was closed to Nora for the duration of his visit, which lasted 3 hours. She worked in the East Library and heard nothing until just before noon, when Mrs. Hollis appeared in the doorway and told her, without ceremony, that his lordship wished to speak with her in the study. Nora set down her cloth and smoothed her apron and went. The study was a room she had not entered before. It faced north, with long windows overlooking the kitchen garden, and it smelled of paper and the particular dry warmth of a fire that had been burning since early morning. The earl was at the writing table, standing rather than seated, and the solicitor, a small sandy-haired man with careful hands and an expression of qualified relief, was closing his document case at the far end of the room. He nodded at Nora with the polite vacancy of a man who is satisfied and already composing his bill. "Miss Fenn," the earl said. He did not indicate a chair. He stood with the same quiet authority as always, and yet something in the room had shifted since yesterday. A kind of settled attention, a decrease in the controlled tension she had read in his jaw on first sight. "Mr. Platt has confirmed the deed." "I am glad, my lord." "The eastern parcel," he said, "has been in dispute with the Norwood family since my father's decline made it unclear whether the transfer he had arranged had ever been formalized. The deed confirms that it was not." He paused. "The land remains part of this estate." "I understand," she said. And she did, in the general way of someone who grasps the fact without the full weight of its particular history. He looked at her for a moment. Mr. Platt's document case gave a soft final click as its clasp engaged. "You knew," the earl said, "what the paper likely was when you found it." She considered this. "I knew it was a document of some kind. I knew it had been placed deliberately. I did not know its substance." "You came to Mrs. Hollis rather than opening it yourself." "It was not mine to open." He said nothing for a short moment. She held his look steadily, because she had been taught by her father that steadiness in another person's direct attention was not presumption. It was respect. "Your father's shop," he said then. "How did it close?" She was not accustomed to being asked about her own situation by people who did not expect to be given a reformulated version of it. She said plainly, "He died. There was not enough in the estate to carry the lease. And you came to Ashfield Park. I required a position. You are wasted on the morning room rugs, Miss Fenn," he said. And the words arrived without particular inflection, as a statement of a fact he had arrived at and wished to deliver accurately, and she felt her breath move more carefully for a moment before she steadied it. She said, "There is a great deal of useful work in rugs, my lord." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite what she would call a smile, something smaller. The particular compression of a man who has been answered in a way he had not expected. "There is," he said. "Nevertheless." He told her, at Mrs. Hollis's suggestion, that her duties were to be expanded to include the care and maintenance of all timepieces in the house, under whatever arrangement Mrs. Hollis considered appropriate. He said this plainly and without performance. She thanked him plainly in return. When she left the study, she did not permit herself to feel anything about the corner of his mouth for the entire length of the corridor. The Dowager Countess, Lady Ashford, arrived at the great house on a Thursday in the 3rd week of November, which was 3 weeks after Nora's duties had been formally expanded and 2 weeks after the upper drawing room clock had been successfully fitted with a new suspension spring, to Mrs. Hollis's visible and uncharacteristic satisfaction. She arrived in a carriage that had been kept at a high shine despite the weather, with a lady's maid whose efficiency was itself a form of comment, and she was in the blue drawing room before her outdoor things had been properly seen to. Nora heard her voice through 2 doors, which gave some indication of its carrying quality. Lady Ashford was 61 and had been a beauty of the first rank in her season, and she moved through the world with the fluency of a woman who had never once been required to explain herself to someone whose opinion she valued. She was kind, in the way people are kind when kindness has never cost them anything, and this was not unkindness exactly, but it was a kind of ease that had produced in her a consistent failure to notice that the world occasionally contained things outside her categorization of it. Her first act, upon settling into the blue drawing room with a cup of tea she had specified in its particulars to the footman, was to request that Mrs. Hollis account for the changes to the household staff assignments. Mrs. Hollis, who had 30 years of managing the particular relationship between a dowager countess and an inherited estate, gave an account that was accurate and concise. Nora heard none of this directly, but received the summary from Jenny that evening, who reported that Lady Ashford had said, with the polished patience of someone correcting an error gently, that it was an unusual arrangement, was it not, to assign clock-minding to a housemaid when the estate ran perfectly well for 40 years on the services of a traveling clocksmith twice yearly. The clock in the corridor outside the blue drawing room chose that morning to stop running. It was an 8-day French clock that Nora had been watching for a fortnight because the click spring on the maintaining power had been showing the early signs of fatigue. She had written a note for Mrs. Hollis 3 days prior, recommending it be sent out for repair by the next quarter, and Mrs. Hollis had noted it with approval and placed it in the household book. The clock stopping was not unexpected. It was also not, in the strict sense of the phrase, convenient timing. She was summoned, not by Mrs. Hollis, but by a footman, and she arrived in the corridor outside the blue drawing room with her tool roll to find that the door to the drawing room was open and that Lady Ashford was standing in it with her cup of tea, observing the stopped clock with the interested expression of someone who has found a useful illustration. "This is the girl," Lady Ashford said to no one in particular. Nora said, "Good morning, my lady." Lady Ashford looked at her. The assessment was comprehensive and took slightly less than 3 seconds. "A housemaid," she said, with the mild clarity of someone reading the label on a jar. "I had thought, when Mrs. Hollis described the arrangement, that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding of my son's wishes." "There was no misunderstanding, my lady." "A housemaid who mends clocks," Lady Ashford continued, as though Nora had not spoken. She addressed the air slightly to Nora's left, which was its own form of statement. "Well, one supposes it keeps them out of the Holland covers." Nora did not respond to this. She opened the corridor clock's case and examined the click spring. She could repair it on the spot with the material she carried. It would take 20 minutes. She set to work with the same composure she brought to every task, and Lady Ashford watched her for a moment, with the amused tolerance of someone watching an unusual animal perform a trick, and then she turned and went back to her drawing room, and the door did not fully close behind her. She heard it said again, 4 days later. Not to her face, which would have required her to exist as an audience, but to Lady Norwood, the wife of the neighboring estate's heir, who had come to call. They were in the front parlor with the door ajar, and Nora was at the clock in the entrance hall, because she was always at a clock somewhere in the house, and the entrance hall happened to be outside the front parlor. The housemaid, Lady Ashford said to Lady Norwood, her voice carrying the particular quality of polished confidence. "Has been given charge of the clocks. Do not ask me to account for it. Arthur has always had his father's peculiar habit of elevating practical persons above their natural station." Lady Norwood said something that Nora could not hear. "Precisely," Lady Ashford said. "She found a document. These things happen. It does not alter what she is." Nora stood at the entrance hall clock with the clock key in her hand and looked at the movement for 3 measured breaths. The clock did not require winding. She had simply been checking the rate. She put the key away and went to find more useful work. The third voicing arrived in a different form, which was the worst kind, second-hand and witnessed. She had been in the upper passage on a Friday, adjusting the rate of the long case clock that stood at the turn of the stair, when she heard Mrs. Hollis in conversation with one of the upper housemaids below. The upper housemaid was relaying something she had heard in the kitchen, which was that cook had heard from Thomas the footman that Lady Ashford had said at dinner the previous evening, in the presence of the Earl and 2 of his visiting associates, that the new arrangement with the clocks was the sort of thing one did not advertise when one wished to recommend a household, and that a housemaid who fancied herself a craftsman was, in the end, a housemaid who had forgotten her place. Mrs. Hollis's response to this report was a brief silence, followed by a decisive change of subject. Nora heard none of the Earl's response at dinner, because Thomas, who had reported the original comment, had either not heard it or had chosen not to include it. She descended the stairs with her tool roll over her arm and went to the East Library, which was still her room in the mornings, and she sat down in the wing chair by the fire, the one with the thin place at the right arm, and she permitted herself, for exactly as long as it took to add a small piece of coal to the grate and watch it catch, to feel what she felt. She had not expected anything. She had come to Ashfield Park to work, and she had worked. And she had found a document in a clock because she was a clockmaker's daughter, and she knew how to look at dark spaces with a tilted light. She had not sought the Earl's attention. She had answered his questions plainly, and had not made more of his attention than it was. She had told herself, on more evenings than she would admit to the wing chair, that his manner toward her was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, the considered courtesy of a man who valued competence regardless of its origin, and that the warmth she sometimes thought she heard in the very lowest register of his voice when he spoke to her was an artifact of her own composition, not a communication of his. She had not been wrong, perhaps, about any of it. It did not prevent her from knowing, with the clarity that came from exhaustion rather than from drama, that she was tired. She was tired of being, in every room she entered, first accounted for in terms of what she was not. She was 23 years old. She was a clockmaker's daughter. She was a housemaid in a house that did not know her, in a county that had already decided she was a category. She would do her work. She would do it well, as she had always done. Because that was not strategy, and it was not defiance. It was simply the only available form of self-respect. The coal caught. She rose from the chair and went back to work. The morning of the gathering at Ashfield Park arrived cold and bright, a Tuesday in late November, when a clear frost had made the park's gravel crisp, and the elms stood without apology against a sky the color of old pewter. Lady Ashford had arranged a small assembly of the local families as a form of welcome for the Earl's new tenancy of the great house, which had been a courtesy owed since spring and delivered late for reasons that included the estate's uncertainty and, more recently, the matters surrounding the deed. Nora had been asked, through Mrs. Hollis, to ensure that every clock in the public rooms was in good order before the guests arrived. She had spent the morning in each of those rooms in turn, moving through the house with her tool roll and her ear making the small adjustments that kept the house's time honest. The blue drawing room, the green parlor, the entrance hall, the morning room, last of all, where the long case clock ticked its recovered steadiness, and the fire had been lit early against the chill. She was seating the hour hand on the morning room clock's dial, correcting a very slight slip that had produced a half-minute error in the striking, when she heard the voices from the entrance hall begin to fill in. She finished her work with care, because half a minute mattered over the course of a gathering, and because it was hers to do, and she did not do things halfway. She closed the clock's door and gathered her tools, and turned to find that the morning room was no longer empty. Lady Ashford stood in the doorway. She was wearing a gown of dark blue silk with a lace collar that had taken considerable labor to produce, and her posture was the particular posture of a woman who was entirely certain of her right to stand in any doorway she chose. Behind her, half a step into the room, was a young woman Nora did not know. She was fair, dressed in the pearl gray of a woman who understands she does not need color to be noticed, and she had the composed expression of someone who had been told, many times and by many people, that she was the correct choice. "Here she is," Lady Ashford said. She said it to the fair woman, not to Nora, with the pleasant ease of someone producing an item they had promised to show. The housemaid, with her tools. The fair woman looked at Nora. Her expression was not unkind. It was simply certain, the way a landscape is certain of its own borders. "Miss Fenn," Lady Ashford continued, still addressing the fair woman, "has made herself indispensable to the clocks. We are all very grateful." The word indispensable landed with the gentle precision of a thumb pressing a bruise. Nora set her tool roll on the side table. "Good morning, my lady," she said. Lady Ashford looked at her then, directly, for the first time in the encounter. "The morning room is required for our guests, Miss Fenn." "Of course," Nora said. She lifted her tool roll. She moved toward the door. The Earl of Ashford was standing in it. She had not heard him. He had the capacity for stillness that made his movements, when they came, somewhat startling. He stood in the doorway of the morning room in a coat of dark blue wool and his white cravat, and the expression she had learned to read as careful attention. And he was looking at her with a quality of directness that was not, this time, the directness of instruction or of inquiry. It was something else, something that did not permit itself to be quickly named. He looked after a moment at his mother, then at the fair woman, whose name, Nora would learn later, was Miss Holt, the niece of a neighboring baronet, whom Lady Ashford had decided was the correct order of things before the November gathering had even been planned. Then he looked back at Nora. "The morning room clock," he said. "I have corrected the striking, my lord. It was half a minute in advance." "Thank you," he said. He did not move from the doorway. "Miss Fenn." Something in the room had altered, and Lady Ashford felt it. She had the instincts of a woman who had managed social rooms for 40 years, and she felt the shift the way one feels a draft before one locates its source. Her expression produced a single, almost imperceptible tightening. "Arthur," she said pleasantly. "Our guests are arriving." "They are," he said. He still did not move. He was looking at Nora in the way she had not permitted herself to make more of than it was, and she was looking back at him with the steadiness her father had taught her, and the morning room clock was ticking its recovered seconds between them. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it quietly, without inflection of the dramatic kind, in the same register he used for every statement of fact. "I have not said, plainly, and in your hearing, what this house owes you. I have allowed it to be understood in arrangements and duties, and that has not been sufficient." Nora said, "My lord." The deed is confirmed, and the eastern parcel is secured, and the Norwood dispute is resolved, and none of that would be so without the morning of the 11th of October, which was your first 2 weeks here, and your good sense and your proper instinct to come to Mrs. Hollis before you touched what was not yours to touch." He paused. "I should have said it then. I did not, because I was occupied with the legal question and not sufficiently attending to the person who had resolved it." Lady Ashford said, "Arthur, this is not the occasion." "It is entirely the occasion," he said, and this time there was something beneath the level tone that was not quite force and not quite warmth, and was entirely his, a quality that Nora had heard once before in his voice, when he had stood beside her at the hall clock, and she had pointed to the rating nut, and she had told herself it was not a communication. "I would like Miss Fenn to remain for the gathering, not in the capacity of staff, in the capacity of a guest." The morning room was very still. Miss Holt's composed expression held for a moment, then produced a slight softening toward something genuine. She was, Nora would understand later, a young woman who had arrived under certain expectations and had just watched those expectations revise themselves, and she was doing this with rather more grace than the occasion required of her. Lady Ashford's fan, which she had been holding at her precise habitual angle, stilled completely. "She is a housemaid," she said. She said it without cruelty. She said it as a woman who genuinely cannot locate the error in her own position. "She is Nora Fenn," he said, "the daughter of the clockmaker of Horton Parva, who was trained to a craft by a man who knew its worth, and who has kept the time in this house honest since the 11th of October, and who found, in the case of a clock no one else had thought to open, the document that settled 7 months of legal complication. She will remain." The calibrated line arrived in the silence after that, quietly, without performance, in the register of a man stating something irrevocable. "And I intend to ask her to stay considerably longer than the season." There was a pause in the morning room that had a particular quality. The clock measured it. Lady Ashford looked at her son with the expression of a woman whose certainty is undergoing a procedural audit, and the audit was not going as expected. Miss Holt looked at the window. The fire ticked. Outside, the voices of arriving guests filled the entrance hall with the ordinary beautiful noise of a November assembly, and none of them knew what was happening in the morning room, and it did not matter, because the only witnesses who needed to be present were present. Lady Ashford's fan moved again, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone recalibrating. She looked at Nora, and this time the look was not the look of a woman labeling a jar. It was, briefly, the look of a woman who has misjudged the height of a step. "Miss Fenn," she said, "I hope you will consider this house a pleasant place to spend the winter." "Thank you, my lady," Nora said. She said it simply. She did not add to it. She met the older woman's eyes with the steadiness that was not defiance and not triumph, and she was aware of the Earl slightly to her left, not near enough to touch, not distant enough to be anywhere else. There are moments when the world does not reverse loudly. They do not always announce themselves with orchestra and declaration. Sometimes the reversal is simply the morning room clock, ticking in its recovered voice, and a man standing in a doorway who has said what he meant in the plainest words available to him, and a woman with a tool roll over her arm who has been asked to stay. The gathering that afternoon was small and pleasant, and unremarkable to anyone who had not been in the morning room at 11 o'clock. Nora spoke to a retired clergyman about the pendulum clocks in his former parish, and she spoke briefly to the solicitor, Mr. Platt, who treated her with the considered respect of a man who has been made aware, in the last month, that he had overlooked a source of significant value. She drank tea that a footman brought to her without any particular comment, because the Earl had instructed the staff as to her status for the afternoon. And she stood near the fire in the green parlor and felt the strange, warm strangeness of being precisely and entirely where she was. He came to stand beside her once, toward the end of the afternoon, when the light had begun to go blue at the windows. He did not address her in the formal mode. "Nora," he said. She looked at him. The green parlor fire was warm at her back, and the first full darkness of November was gathering at the windows, and the clock on the parlor mantel was keeping its honest time. "I have written to Mr. Platt," he said, asking him to look into the question of the clockmaker's shop in Horton Parva, the lease and the contents, what may yet be recoverable. She said very quietly, "You did not need to do that." "No," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at the fire for a moment. She was aware of the warmth of his arm not quite touching hers. She was aware of something in her chest that had nothing to do with mechanical function and everything to do with the specific fact of being known, not as a category, not as a function, not as a thing that had been useful, but as a person whose history was worth recovering. She said, "The mainspring in the parlor mantel clock is original. It is likely 40 years old. It wants replacement before the new year." There was a pause. Then very quietly, at the corner of his mouth, something that was this time fully a smile. Small and real and unhurried. "It does," he said. "You will see to it?" "Yes," she said. "I will." They stood there for a moment longer, with the November dark at the windows and the fire at their backs and the clock keeping its time above the mantel. And it was not a dramatic thing, and it was not a grand thing, and it was entirely sufficient. The following morning, before the household was properly awake, Nora returned to the morning room. The long case clock stood where it had always stood, tall and dark and measured in its keeping. She opened the lower door and looked at the interior where the paper had been, at the pendulum housing and the back panel and the particular quality of the dark inside. It was empty now. It had been empty since October. She looked at it for a moment in the early light, the way she had looked at it that first morning, with care and without assumption. She closed the door. She set the pendulum swinging with the lightest touch of her finger against the rating nut, the correction so small as to be nearly nothing, and she listened to the tick resolve itself back into its recovered steadiness, and the morning room filled once more with the sound of honest time. By the following spring, when the elms were green again and the Eastern parcel's disputed title had been formally enrolled in the county records, and when Mr. Platt had located and redeemed the remaining contents of the clockmaker's shop on Horton Parva's High Street, including 2 unfinished pocket watches and a set of tools that had belonged to Nora's grandfather, the morning room clock stood in its corner and measured the hours of a house that had been made to remember, after a very long silence, what it meant to keep proper time. Arthur set the watches on the mantel beside it. He did not say anything. She understood. She touched the edge of the nearer watch with one finger, and the old brass was cool, and then it was warm, and the clock ticked behind them both. And the April light came through the tall windows and fell across the floor of the morning room without ceremony, as light has always done, in houses that have finally stopped forgetting what they contain. If this story found you at the right hour, leave a thought in the quiet below. We will be here when you return.